The word Russia comes from a group of Swedish Vikings who paddled their longships down a river system they had never seen before, looking for silver, and accidentally built one of the largest nations in human history. Then, 1,000 years later, that nation quietly erased them from its own founding story. This is the story of the Varangians, who they were, what they built, how a Soviet government decided the truth was politically inconvenient, and why the archaeological evidence makes the erasure impossible to maintain. Most people know one version of the Viking story: longships heading west, raids on English monasteries, settlements in Normandy and Iceland, a disputed landfall in North America. That Western narrative is dramatic and well documented, and it completely overshadows a second expansion that went in the opposite direction and had consequences of a different order entirely. Swedish and to a lesser extent Norwegian Vikings, known in Eastern sources as the Rus or the Varangians, navigated a river system stretching from the Baltic Sea through the heart of what is now Russia, Ukraine, and Belarus, all the way to the Black Sea and the Caspian Sea. At the end of those rivers lay Constantinople and the Abbasid Caliphate, two of the wealthiest civilizations on Earth. The primary routes were two, and they defined the entire economic geography of early medieval Eastern Europe. The Volga trade route ran from the Gulf of Finland eastward through Lake Ladoga, south down the Volga River, and into the Caspian Sea, providing direct access to the silver of the Islamic world. The route from the Varangians to the Greeks ran from the Baltic through the Dnieper River system, south to the Black Sea and Constantinople, the richest city in the world at that time. Connecting the river systems required portages, stretches where boats had to be dragged or physically carried overland between waterways. These were not casual summer adventures. They were months-long journeys through territories populated by various Slavic, Finnic, and steppe peoples, requiring both the military capability to survive hostile encounters and the commercial skill to negotiate profitable ones. The word Varangian itself is believed to derive from the Old Norse word varar, meaning pledge or oath, most likely referring to the sworn agreements that bound these traveling merchants and warriors together into cohesive groups capable of surviving the journey. Finnish-speaking peoples who interacted with them called them ruotsi, a word referring to the Swedish mainland. Linguistic scholars believe ruotsi is the etymological origin of Rus, and ultimately of Russia itself. That chain, from a Finnish word for Sweden, through the name of a Viking trading network, to the name of the largest country on Earth, is one of the most consequential etymological accidents in the history of political geography. One of the most vivid first-hand accounts of the Rus comes not from a Scandinavian source, but from an Arab traveler named Ahmed ibn Fadlan, who encountered a group of Rus merchants on the Volga in 921 CE. Ibn Fadlan described them in remarkable detail: tall men with reddish complexions, tattooed from their fingernails to their necks, wearing distinctive cloaks, and carrying out an elaborate ship burial ritual for a deceased chieftain that he observed firsthand. The ritual he described, in which a slave woman was killed and cremated alongside the chieftain on a burning vessel, closely matches descriptions of Scandinavian funerary practices documented at archaeological sites in Scandinavia itself. Ibn Fadlan had no reason to align his account with Scandinavian cultural practices, no knowledge of Scandinavian archaeology, and no agenda beyond recording what he actually saw. His account is one of the most reliable ethnographic documents from the early Viking Age, precisely because it comes from an outside observer with no stake in any particular interpretation. The formal founding of the Rus state is recorded in a document called the Primary Chronicle, also known as the Tale of Bygone Years, compiled by a monk named Nestor at the Kiev-Pechersk monastery around 1113 CE. According to the chronicle, the Slavic and Finnic tribes of the north were locked in constant internal conflict and, unable to govern themselves effectively, sent a delegation across the sea to the Varangian Rus with one of the most extraordinary political invitations in recorded history. The delegation reportedly told them, "Our land is great and rich, but there is no order in it. Come to reign and rule over us." In 862 CE, a Varangian leader named Rurik arrived and established himself at Novgorod. This event is known as the Calling of the Varangians, and it is the traditional founding moment of the Russian state, a state, according to its own founding document, that was built by Swedes who were invited in because the locals could not stop fighting each other. Rurik's successor Oleg, whose Slavic name is a direct translation of the Norse name Helgi, moved south and seized Kiev around 882 CE, establishing it as the capital of what became Kievan Rus. Oleg led a famous raid on Constantinople in 907, during which he reportedly nailed his shield to the city's gates as a trophy, a gesture saturated with Viking symbolism. He then negotiated a trading treaty with the Byzantine Empire that gave the Rus preferential commercial access to Constantinople's markets, transforming a raiding relationship into a trading empire. The dynasty that Rurik established ruled the Rus lands for over 7 centuries, until the death of Fedor in 1598. The names of its early rulers leave almost no room for ambiguity about their origins. Rurik is the Slavic adaptation of the Norse Hrorkr. Oleg is Helgi, Igor is Ingvar, Olga is Helga. Every one of those names is unmistakably Norse in etymology, carried by rulers who built a state that would eventually call itself Russia. The archaeological record is unambiguous about the Scandinavian presence in the Upper Rus territories during the 9th and 10th centuries. Excavations at Staraya Ladoga, one of the oldest towns in Russia, founded around 750 CE, have produced material culture indistinguishable from contemporaneous Scandinavian finds. Oval brooches of characteristic Viking type, Norse-style swords, cremation burials with grave goods matching Scandinavian traditions, and runic inscriptions. Similar finds appear at Gnezdovo near Smolensk, and at numerous sites throughout the Upper Dnieper and Volga regions. A major study published in the journal Nature in 2020, examining ancient DNA from across Viking Age Europe, found strong evidence of Scandinavian genetic influence at sites in Eastern Europe associated with the early Rus expansion. The convergence of linguistic evidence, material cultural evidence, documentary evidence from the primary chronicle first-hand accounts like Ibn Fadlan's, and now ancient DNA data creates an evidentiary picture that is, in the words of the mainstream contemporary scholarly consensus, decisive. And yet, for a significant stretch of the 20th century, this entire body of evidence was officially dismissed, minimized, and reframed by the Soviet state. The controversy over the Scandinavian origin of Kievan Rus is known among historians as the Normanist controversy, and it has a history stretching back to the 18th century. The debate began when German scholars at the Russian Academy of Sciences in St. Petersburg, Gottlieb Bayer, Gerhard Friedrich Müller, and August Ludwig von Schlosser used the primary chronicle to argue that the Rus state was founded by Norse Vikings. The Russian scholar Mikhail Lomonosov vigorously rejected this interpretation, arguing instead for indigenous Slavic origins. The political stakes were obvious to everyone involved. The Normanist position implied that Slavic peoples had required Germanic outsiders to build their state, a narrative with deeply uncomfortable implications for Russian national pride. But it was in the Soviet era that the anti-Normanist position became something more than an academic disagreement. Soviet scholars and ideologists declared the indigenous Slavic origin of the Rus state to be effectively official doctrine. The political logic was straightforward and brutal. A founding narrative in which the ancestors of the Russian people invited Swedish Vikings to come rule over them because they couldn't manage it themselves was incompatible with Soviet nationalism and the ideological glorification of Slavic civilization. Anti-Normanist scholars produced alternative readings of the archaeological evidence, dismissed the linguistic connections, minimized the documentary record, and built an academic framework specifically designed to support a conclusion that had been decided in advance on ideological grounds. It was not scholarship in search of truth. It was scholarship in service of a political identity that could not tolerate the truth the evidence pointed to. Outside the Soviet ideological framework, the contemporary scholarly consensus has shifted decisively back to a version of the Normanist position. Most historians today accept that the early Rus elite was of Scandinavian origin, and that Scandinavians played a foundational role in establishing the political structures of early Kievan Rus. The same historians also emphasize, correctly, that this elite assimilated into Slavic culture with remarkable speed. Within a few generations, the ruling dynasty had adopted Slavic language and Orthodox Christianity, intermarried extensively with local populations, and built a genuinely synthetic civilization drawing on Scandinavian, Slavic, Finnic, and Byzantine elements in roughly equal measure. The Rus state was not a Viking colonial imposition that remained foreign. It was a Viking-founded structure that rapidly became something entirely its own. One of the most remarkable institutional legacies of the entire Varangian Eastern expansion sits not in Russia at all, but in Constantinople. Beginning in the late 10th century, the Byzantine emperors began recruiting Norse warriors, and later Anglo-Saxon warriors, as a personal bodyguard unit called the Varangian Guard. These soldiers were prized for two qualities: their ferocity in battle, and the fact that as foreigners with no local political connections, they had no dynastic loyalty to any Byzantine faction. They could be trusted to remain loyal to the emperor, personally, rather than to whichever noble house happened to be in the ascendant at any given moment. Harald Hardrada, the man who would become King of Norway and die at the Battle of Stamford Bridge in 1066, just weeks before William the Conqueror won at Hastings, served in the Varangian Guard. The Guard remained in Byzantine service until the fall of Constantinople to the Ottoman Turks in 1453, a continuous institutional thread connecting Norse warriors all the way to the last days of the Eastern Roman Empire. The name Russia endures today as the most permanent monument to a Swedish Viking trading and raiding network that, 7 centuries before the word Russia existed as a political concept, was paddling its longships down the Dnieper toward Constantinople. The people who gave Russia its name did not intend to found a nation. They were looking for silver routes to the Islamic world, and they found something considerably larger. The fact that one of the world's great powers then spent most of the 20th century officially pretending those people never existed says something important. Not about the Vikings, but about how national identity shapes the history that nations are willing to tell about themselves. If you want to understand another case where the real history of a place was deliberately rewritten to serve a political identity that couldn't survive the truth, the next video on this channel covers exactly that, and it is just as strange as this one.